Hello again, students. We just want to finish up the Topic 8 overview, as well as covering the extended response questions that are going to be on the Topic 8 test for those of you who weren't in class last Friday. So we should be on the back side of the page, starting with these questions here. Factors that contributed to growing prosperity in the 1950s. So we're looking at kind of that financial prosperity of the U.S. at that time, one of the more prosperous, most prosperous decades in U.S. history, and importantly, it was very much more evenly spread out, though of course not evenly, but much more than other prosperous decades like the 90s or the 20s. Some of the factors contributing: increased productivity in manufacturing, making products less expensive and more available. The GI Bill, with the government subsidizing loans for homes and businesses, as well as financial support for veterans going to college. The highways interconnecting the country and facilitating trade. The baby boom and all of the consumerism that will go along with it. Unions were particularly strong in this time period as well, which helped keep blue-collar wages relatively high. Entrepreneurship was also at an all-time high in the sort of free market sector of things, as well as the government's military spending, which stimulated a lot of other economic areas. Changes that occurred in the 1950s, if you look at Lesson 4, it's all about changes. So the growth of the suburbs, as well as the Sunbelt, the consumerism, the car culture, rock and roll, the baby boom, all of these are major changes going on in the United States during the 1950s. And this one in particular relates to one of your extended response questions. And then, of course, also advances in science from this time, things like vaccines, penicillin. The average lifespan of Americans increased over the 1950s because so many fewer people were dying in childhood from diseases like polio. Television shapes American culture and politics tremendously during this time period, and continues to do so today, although in different forms. Automation at factories, allowing for increased productivity, as well as things like chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides used to increase farm production. But of course, when we get to the new environmental movement of the 1970s, we'll talk about some of the negative impacts of that. But in the 50s, we're also looking at the increased productivity, making food more readily available and less expensive for people. The next two questions have to do with suburbanization and how they affected both the suburbs and the cities. As more people moved out of the cities and into the suburbs, in short, became richer, whiter, and politically more conservative. And as the suburbs grow in population, we'll see, again, once we get into the late 70s and into the 80s, how this is going to affect national politics as the U.S. becomes more conservative politically in that time, leading up even through to today. We still are. And as the suburbs became richer, whiter, and more conservative, the cities became poorer, browner, and more liberal. The FHA and the GI Bill, which gave loans, low-interest government-backed loans for building homes in the suburbs, purposefully discriminated against people of color, making it more difficult for them to get homes out in the suburbs. So many remained in the cities despite having the financial ability to afford homes. They were just unable to get the loans. And as the middle class moves out of the city, they take their tax dollars with them. And without those tax dollars, cities have a harder time providing services. Teachers get laid off and class sizes become larger. School facilities aren't as well kept up because they just don't have the money for all of that, leading to poorer education in these areas. Crime rates go up. They can't afford to hire as many police officers as they would normally want, plus all of the other services that are generally provided in cities to reduce the effects of poverty, which also, of course, decreases the crime rate, were not really available. Last migration we want to look at is that of the Sunbelt, or to the Sunbelt, which is the south and southwestern region of the country, and looking at what led to it as well as what the effects of this were. In the Sunbelt, you've got a warmer climate, although the summers can be very, very hot. So the development of window unit air conditioners is going to help people to tolerate those summers. And that attracts many people to this area. The Bracero program had brought a lot of Mexican immigrants to the United States Southwest during World War II, and many will remain there, although there is a concerted effort by the federal government to try to forcibly repatriate or deport many of these Braceros now that their work was no longer needed. Many still remained, and a lot migrated to the cities too in the Southwest. Cubans. During the 1950s, Cuba becomes communist under Fidel Castro, and many Cubans flee Cuba to the United States, and one of the closest places there is going to be Florida. So we'll see a sizable increase in the Cuban population in that area. And then lastly, of course, whenever we talk about any migration, one of the reasons is almost always jobs, right? People don't move someplace so they can be unemployed and homeless. They move because they feel like there's some sort of economic opportunity there. And in the Sun Belt, it was a lot of defense, tech, and aerospace industries that were located in that area. So think Silicon Valley in California, aerospace and NASA in Texas and Florida, and then just a lot of the defense factories as well as military bases, because the United States remains we don't fully demobilize after World War II. We remain on a fairly high military footing, though not quite the same level because of the Cold War. And a lot of those military bases and defense industries were purposefully located by Franklin Roosevelt in the Southeast because of the economic problems there were worse really than almost anywhere else in the country. Were bad before the Depression, and during the Depression he saw an opportunity to try and stimulate their economies with this. Politically, what we see with the Sun Belt, larger population means more votes. More votes means more power in Congress and the Electoral College. So the Sun Belt states will grow to have a bigger impact on national politics. And think of places like Florida, California, Texas, 3 of the top 5 largest states by population in the country are all Sunbelt states. And the South, particularly the Southeast, but the Southwest too, tended to be much more conservative. So this is another contributing factor, along with the growth of the suburbs, to the sort of swing to the right for U.S. politics. Taking a look at the 2 extended response questions, starting with the first one, identify and explain 2 specific ways the Cold War affected U.S. foreign policy and 2 specific ways it affected the U.S. domestically. So you need 4 answers total, 2 from foreign policy, which means how we interact with other countries, 2 domestically, meaning what's going on at home in the United States. So you need to make sure you've got 2 of each. So starting with the 2 foreign policy issues, if you look at lessons 1 and 2, particularly lesson 1, you're going to find a lot of options there that you can use to support this. Lesson 1 is all about the containment policy, and that's the predominant focus of the United States foreign policy in the Cold War, the containment of communism. So you can look at some specific incidents that we did in service of containment, such as the Berlin Airlift, the Marshall Plan, the Korean War, and forming NATO and SEATO, as well as others. The other side, the domestic side, you'll probably find a lot of good answers in lessons 3 and lessons 5. So some of the examples here, the Second Red Scare, the formation of HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, McCarthyism, the space race, Americans becoming more religious, and so forth. Be sure then with each of these 4 that you are clear how it is related to the Cold War. So just saying Americans became more religious, for example, is only telling me or identifying a change. What I also need is to understand how it's related to the Cold War. So communism was usually very specifically atheistic. So Americans started to become more religious in contrast to the communists, or what we saw as godless communists. So we start doing things like adding under God to the Pledge of Allegiance and in God we trust to our money. So just make sure when you explain these things, it's clear what this has to do with our rivalry with the Soviet Union or the communist world in a more general sense. The second question, we're looking at changes in post-World War II America, so late 40s and into the 1950s. I want you to identify 4 of those changes and explain how each one affected the United States. So lessons 4 especially, but also lesson 5 is where you can find a lot of information on this. Lesson 4, everything I put on that graphic organizer is they're all changes, and what you need to do is identify how they affected the United States. So examples would be the baby boom, the GI Bill, the Interstate Highway Act, the growth of the suburbs and the Sunbelt, consumerism, car culture, the nuclear family, and so on and so on. So there's many more options that you could put in here than just these. You need to have 4 of them. And as in the previous one, make sure it's clear, in this case, how it affected the United States. So some things might actually affect, or the effect of some things might be some of the other ones. For example, the Interstate Highway Act made it easier for people to commute from the suburbs into the cities where they worked, and that contributes to the growth of the suburbs. So the effect of that is actually another change that we see with the growth of the suburbs, and you can use the growth of the suburbs then sort of chain these together to explain what are the effects there. So both of these questions are cause and effect questions. In the first one, I've given you the cause, which is the Cold War, and I ask you to explain 2 domestic and 2 foreign effects. So you're going to identify 4 effects and explain them. In this one, you are going to be providing the changes, the causes, and explaining how they changed the United States, what the effect of each of these is. All right, good luck.